These are some of the most disturbing crimes committed by members of the DC community, and as the video goes on, the cases only get darker. It's May of 2011, around 1 AM, in Petoskey, Michigan. Police get a call about someone on the roof of a downtown building, and when they arrive, they find a man in a full Batman costume hanging off the side of the wall. His name is Mark Wayne Williams, and yes, his middle name is actually Wayne. After pulling him back onto the roof, officers search him, and what they find in his utility belt isn't exactly what you'd expect from a neighborhood watch volunteer. A collapsible steel baton, a canister of chemical irritant spray, and a pair of fleet-lined gloves. Mark's arrested on the spot and charged with trespassing and carrying concealed weapons. And when he's brought in for arraignment, still in full Batman costume, he tells the court, quote,
"I realize this is a serious offense. I honestly had no idea the items I was holding were illegal. I did not intend to harm anyone with these items. I swear that."
Now here's where it gets amazing. Mark isn't just some random guy who decided to dress up one night. He's part of an actual community of self-proclaimed real-life superheroes or costume activists. People who put on costumes and patrol their neighborhoods, feed the homeless, escort people through dangerous areas. And Mark, he took it very seriously. He even had a partner who dressed up as Batgirl. Now he ends up pleading guilty to obstructing a police officer, but the weapons charges at least gets dropped. The judge sentences him to 6 months probation. But there's a catch. For the entire duration of his probation, he's banned from wearing the costume. And you'd think this would be the end of it, but it wasn't. A year later, in September of 2012, Mark is back out on patrol. He and his girlfriend, dressed as Batgirl, spot what they think is suspicious activity near a hit-and-run scene, and so they call 911. But when state troopers arrive, they find Mark already walking around the crime scene in full Batman gear once again. The problem was that the police had a K9 unit searching for the suspect, and Mark's scent kept throwing the dog off trail, and so he's arrested again, this time for obstruction of justice. And when asked about it later, Mark said the trooper told him,
"People are scared of you. You're 33 years old. You need to just give up."
Despite a petition being launched by another fellow superhero dressed up as Robin, Mark was eventually sentenced to 30 days in jail, though most of it was later suspended. He was ordered to only wear his costume within city limits, and shortly after, he decided to auction off his original suit on eBay to pay for his legal fees, and it sold for $152.50. Now at least his intentions weren't bad, which is something that can most definitely not be said for the next person.
You have someone out there that has said, hey, there is a serial harasser.
In September 2018, DC Comics launched the first title in a major relaunch of their Vertigo imprint. Vertigo is basically DC's adult-focused mini-brand for the more mature and darker stories, made for grown-ups, and the title was called Border Town, which was a magic realist series about immigration and Latino identity set in a fictional Arizona border town. The book was written by Eric Esquivel, a Latino-American comic writer who'd spent years working his way up through the industry. The series was an instant hit. Critics loved it, with some even calling it the Mexican-American Stranger Things. The first issue sold out so fast that DC rushed it back to print just to meet the demand, and by the end of the year, Border Town was already on multiple Best of 2018 lists, and Eric was even named Breakout Writer of the Year by Multiversity Comics. And DC had bigger plans for him. They were preparing to hand him the keys to one of their most beloved characters, Nightwing, and Eric was about to become a major name in the DC universe. But in December of 2018, everything came crashing down. On December 9th, a toy designer named Cynthia Noggle published a detailed account on her blog, describing years of abuse at the hands of someone she called X, a man she identified as working in the comic book industry, living in Tucson, who had a Vertigo comic launch that summer. And of course, it didn't take long for people to connect the dots. According to Cynthia, the abuse started back in 2012 or 2013. She'd just gone through a rough breakup with her long-term boyfriend and was in a vulnerable place. And at the time, she was working at a comic shop in Tucson called Heroes and Villains. And the owner just decided to expand the marketing department, so she became the new assistant to the new marketing manager X, a man she would later identify as Eric, of course. At first, Eric acted like a friend. He was there for her during her breakup and listened to her, and even provided emotional support. But then during one of their conversations at his apartment, where Cynthia opened up about her physical relationship with her ex-boyfriend, things changed. He got closer and put his hand on her hip and kissed her. And what happened next, according to Cynthia, was not consensual in any meaningful way. Cynthia described being unable to stop shaking as he forcefully started to take off her clothes. And she would keep on repeating, "I'm nervous," over and over, unable to even look at him, which he would respond by slapping her across the face. And she then said she couldn't do anything after that. She just let it happen. The same night, after the thing he just did, Eric brought his girlfriend over to the Heroes and Villains during work hours. Eric and his girlfriend were in a polyamorous relationship, so she knew about Cynthia. And later when Cynthia went into the shop back room, Eric followed her and pushed her against the wall and started to repeat the same pattern. Cynthia rejected his advances and said that she isn't comfortable doing this with him with his girlfriend in the next room, but Eric wouldn't take no for an answer, and according to Cynthia, he still removed her clothing and grabbed both of her wrists, dragging her into the room where his girlfriend was sitting at. He wanted to show her off to his girlfriend and desired to have a 3-person physical activity with the two of them. Now his girlfriend actually just sat there and complimented Cynthia's body, but said no to Eric's idea, and this was when Cynthia took the chances and ran out, grabbed her clothes, and then left alone crying. But this was just the beginning. This behavior would continue for months, and whenever she refused refused, he would threaten to go after her friends instead, including students that weren't of age working at the store, who he called minions. And after just a few refusals, Eric did exactly what he said he would. He would soon start pressuring Cynthia into being intimate with him during work hours, in the shop's back room. And if she refused, he would become impossible to work with, judgmental about the comics she read and what food she ate, and who she was friends with. And this got so bad that Cynthia soon started only bringing vegan food to avoid his criticism, and only read books that he approved of. She also stopped talking about her male friends entirely, scared that he might do something to her or them out of anger or jealousy. She was losing herself without realizing it, until she did. Eventually, Cynthia started distancing herself from Eric and started dating again. Now, on the night of her first date, she had to bring a change of clothes to work and got dressed up, ready to leave. Her date was already waiting outside, but to her horror, Eric would see her and stop her entirely. He wouldn't let her go until he had marked his territory. But despite that, she managed to get into her date's car, feeling disgusted with herself. Now, at last, Eric moved from Tucson to Los Angeles, and Cynthia got back together with her ex-boyfriend. But she actually kept in contact with Eric, trying to convince herself that if she could just see the good in him, maybe she wouldn't feel so bad about what happened to her. But that didn't work. The manipulation continued. He would continue to send her explicit photos and have inappropriate conversations with her. He would also tell her things like,
"We should have ended up together, and you love me."
But the final breaking point came over a year before she published her account. When Eric bragged to her about meeting the parents of a student who was of a protected age group he was planning to sleep with. He'd been teaching writing classes at a comic shop in LA at the time, and so this was his plan. And that's when Cynthia finally decided to cut him out of her life. This is when she truly realized the extent of what happened to her. Now, in December of 2018, Cynthia's account spread rapidly through comic book circles, and actually other women came forward saying that they had experienced similar behavior from Eric, and his collaborators on Border Town were among the first to respond. The colorist working on Border Town, Tamara Bonvillain, announced that she was leaving the book immediately.
"The way he treated her was disgusting and inexcusable,"
she wrote on Twitter.
"It shames me to have spent so much time and energy working with someone who's capable of such actions."
The artist Ramon Villalobos released a longer statement expressing his devastation.
"I have made it my practice to believe women, full stop. To know the art that I'm so proud of and the world I've lived and created for the last year of my life had brought so much pain to individuals frankly outweighs the joy I know it brought to others."
Both of them quit the series completely, but the worst has yet to come. Within days, DC made their decision. They cancelled Border Town entirely. Issues 5 and 6 would never be published, and issues 1 through 4 were returnable, which means that the retailers could send them back for refunds. DC even removed all listings for the series from Diamond Comics' website, as if trying to erase any trace that the comic had ever existed. And Nightwing, the book Eric was supposed to take over in March 2019, DC quietly removed his name from the copies before they were even officially released. And as far as DC was concerned, he was never going to write that book. Now, Eric released a statement denying the allegations. He called them reckless and false. He also claimed that their relationship was unconventional, but that they always treated one another with dignity and respect. He also said that he would fully cooperate with any investigation. But his career at DC was over, although his story wasn't. In February of 2020, Eric resurfaced with an announcement that shocked the industry all over again. He was launching a new publishing venture called Alternate Empire, and the first planned release was a comic called El Ronin, set to launch on Kickstarter. He claimed that 10% of proceeds would go to a charity called Restorative Education Services in Los Angeles. But through searches through the IRS, Charity Navigator, and Charity Watch, nobody actually found any organization by that name registered anywhere in the country, proving that this statement was also nothing but a publicity stunt. But the most shocking part wasn't that Eric was making a return in the industry. It was that he wasn't alone in his new business venture. He partnered up with Eddie Berganza, a man very similar to Eric in all the wrong ways, and the person I'll be talking about next.
As you may not know, a DC comic writer had some interesting things to say.
It's December 2006. Liz Scarlett Marsham is 29 years old and she's living her dream. She just started working at DC Comics 3 weeks ago, and she's so excited that she just runs around the office during her first week, taking pictures of everything and anything, sending them to her parents. She can't believe that this is real. But what Liz does know is that one of the most powerful editors at the company has already noticed her, and in a few hours her dream job is about to turn into a nightmare that will follow her for the next decade. The evening after work, the DC staff heads to McGee, a bar near the office. It's a casual hangout, the kind of place where editors and writers grab drinks and talk shop, and Liz is sitting at the bar when Eddie Berganza walks over. Eddie is a veteran editor at DC. He's been with the company since 1992, working his way up through the ranks. He oversees some of DC's most valuable projects: Superman, Batman, and most ironically, Wonder Woman. If you want to work on the big books at DC, you need Eddie's approval. He's known in the industry for being funny, social, and the guy everyone wants to hang out with. And he's so passionate about DC that people around the office call him the Nerd King. Back at the bar, Eddie has a camera, and he suggests taking a picture with Liz. She agrees, and as he leans in, he kisses her on the lips. Liz freezes. She wasn't expecting that, and when she tells Eddie that she wasn't ready, he creepily suggests they take another photo. Still confused and processing what just happened, Liz agrees. This time, as Eddie leans in, he sticks his tongue in her mouth while she's still chewing on a french fry, and all she can think to say is,
"There's a fry in my mouth."
She laughs awkwardly, trying to make sense of what's happening, and Eddie simply then walks away. But later that night, he comes back, and this time he tries to touch her inappropriately, one hand reaching for her hip and the other one going under her chest. Liz dodges him, and Eddie just laughs it off as if it was a joke. Liz has worked at DC Comics for less than 3 weeks now, and as senior editor, who's someone who could make or break her career, just did something something inappropriate to her twice in one night, but she decides against reporting it. You see, the comic industry is tiny. DC Comics and Marvel are called the Big Two because they're basically the only major publishers that matter. Everyone who works there knows that they beat out thousands of other people for their jobs, and so speaking up could mean losing everything. So Liz stays quiet and tries to move on. And Eddie, his career keeps climbing. Over the next few years, Eddie's reputation grows even further, and not just for his editorial work. Around the office, people actually start warning each other about him. New female employees are quietly told to watch out, to not get drinks alone with him. And Eddie would continue to make things harder for the female assistants, criticizing their work for no good reason and trying to engage in inappropriate conversations. He would even tell one of his colleagues that the only reason he didn't hit on her was because he respected her husband too much. And soon enough, one of the editors named Janelle, best known for her work on Batgirl, had enough, and she started warning everybody about it. But the warnings didn't stop Eddie, and not long after, another story would spread throughout the DC offices about an editor named Joanne who was at a staff party at McGee's, the same bar where Eddie attacked Liz, when Eddie grabbed her and tried to pull her in for a kiss. She told him no, but he kept on trying, and finally Joanne snapped at him and said,
"If you don't take that arm off, I'm gonna break it."
Joanne has been at DC for 5 years. She's a veteran cartoonist, openly feminist, and openly gay. She doesn't take stuff from anyone, but even she doesn't report what Eddie did. She tells herself that it doesn't matter because it happened outside the office, and Eddie knew that she was gay anyway. She overlooks it and tries to forget it instead. Now, by the spring of 2010, Eddie's being considered for a major promotion to executive editor, and when editor Janelle hears about this, she's terrified. She's already tried her best to warn everybody against it because she knows what Eddie is capable of, and the idea of him having even more power over women at the company scares the hell out of her. And so Janelle decides to do something, officially this time. She files a complaint with DC's HR department and encourages others to come forward. And so in total, 5 people speak to HR that summer, and Liz tells them what Eddie did to her back in 2006. Joanne tells them about the attempted kiss, and another employee who saw Eddie kiss Liz that night at the bar backs up her story. And after confessing to HR, they're being told that their complaint is being taken seriously and that they should trust the process. But for a month, nothing happens. No updates, no consequences, nothing. But then in October of 2010, DC actually calls a staff meeting. The company announces a reorganization, and as part of that reorganization, Eddie Berganza is promoted to executive editor. The man 5 people just reported to HR for harassment is given more power and more responsibility. Janelle is devastated, and Liz is horrified. And the message is pretty clear. DC values Eddie more than it values the women's safety. And a few months later, DC launches a massive reboot of its superhero universe. And Liz, now a coordinating editor, is required to attend day-long closed-door meetings with Eddie and other senior staff. And so she decides to go to the editor-in-chief, a man named Bob, who knows about her complaint, and asks if Eddie really has oversight on every book now. And Bob simply confirms that he does. And after that conversation, Liz decides to stop editing comics entirely. She focuses on scheduling and paperwork instead, removing herself from the creative work she loves. And over the next 6 years, she would become physically ill from the stress. She would wake up every morning not wanting to go to work. And by the time she finally decides to leave DC completely, she's completely demoralized. Janelle, on the other hand, had already left DC less than a year after Eddie's promotion, and every single woman who filed a complaint in 2010 would eventually leave the company, but Eddie simply stayed. And then in March of 2012, Eddie does it again, this time at WonderCon, a major comic convention in Anaheim, California. On the evening of March 10th, Eddie again is at a bar, this time in the Hilton Hotel lobby. The lobby is packed with people from the convention, creators, editors, and fans. And a 27-year-old woman who we'll call Diane is there with her boyfriend, a freelance writer who works with DC under Eddie himself. She's just trying to network, hoping to break into the industry too. Now Eddie decides to approach Diane, and in the middle of the lobby, with dozens of witnesses including her boyfriend watching, he would decide to stick his tongue down her throat. People pull Eddie off, and Diane runs to her hotel room, terrified and confused. But despite that, she still doesn't report it to DC. She's scared that it might destroy her career and her boyfriend's work with the company, especially considering he works directly under Eddie. But the incident is so public by the next morning that industry blogger Rich Johnston has already received multiple reports about it. And so a week later, on March 26th, Rich publishes the story on Bleeding Cool. He doesn't name Eddie at first. He just describes him as a senior comic book figure who tried to make out with a freelancer's partner in the middle of a hotel room with dozens of witnesses. But within the industry, everyone basically knows that it's Eddie. And after the article is published, the higher-ups have no choice but to do something about it. And so when Eddie returns to work in April, there are finally consequences. He's demoted from executive editor back to group editor, and his convention travel is temporarily banned. He's also put through behavioral programs mandated by Warner Bros., which owns DC, in case you didn't know. But he's not fired, and he's still given oversight of the Superman titles, some of DC's most valuable properties, even though his behavior is a well-known open secret at this point. Now, over time, something strange happens. No women are actually assigned to work in the Superman office. No female staff report directly to Eddie, and no female freelancers are hired for his books. It's as if DC has decided to, instead of removing Eddie, they just remove all the women, a decision that would soon hurt them, as people from all over the industry would soon start distancing themselves from DC altogether. New writers such as Marjorie Liu, best known for her work on the X-Men and Monstrous, would explicitly tell DC she couldn't write for them because of Eddie, and despite the company trying to reassure her that she wouldn't have to deal with him directly, she would still refuse, and she was far from the only one. In 2015, a writer and artist named Sophie, best known for her work for the original Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles comics, was offered a chance to work on Supergirl, and this was exactly the kind of project she'd normally jump at. But when she learned that Eddie was the editor in charge, she would turn it down completely. For Sophie, even the idea of his name being on something that she created makes her uncomfortable. And another writer named Amy had a similar experience. In 2015, 2015, she was assigned to write a Poison Ivy story for DC, and she was really excited until she learned about Eddie being her editor. But she actually felt like she couldn't object because it was her first possible book at DC, so she actually found a different way to express her anger. In the script, she turned a minor character named Winston, who was based on Eddie, into a workplace creep who would be taken down by Poison Ivy using her famous poison kiss. But then in 2016, DC would make yet another decision that would make the situation even worse. The company goes through another restructuring, and an editor named Shelley Bond, a 20-year-old veteran known for her work on The Sandman, iZombie, and The Invisibles, has her position completely eliminated, while Eddie just keeps his job. And of course, people across the industry would explode with anger. They would openly ask why Shelley was gone, while Eddie, a man with multiple harassment complaints, gets to stay. And so DC finally issues a statement, saying it takes harassment seriously and will review its policies. But Eddie's name isn't mentioned, and he remains employed. But everything finally changes in the fall of 2017. Harvey Weinstein, Kevin Spacey, Louis C.K., across Hollywood, powerful men are finally being held accountable online because of the #MeToo movement, which is now everywhere. And women who've stayed silent about Eddie for years start reconsidering whether it's safe to come forward. And they finally do. On November 10th, 2017, BuzzFeed News publishes an investigation. For the first time, Liz, Janelle, and Joanne speak on the record about what Eddie did. The article details everything: the 2006 attack, the 2010 complaints, the promotion, and the 2012 WonderCon incident, and DC's repeated failure to protect women. The article blows up, and the very next day, DC suspends Eddie. And then 2 days later, on November 13th, 2017, 5 years after WonderCon and 7 years after the HR complaints, Eddie is finally fired. But more women actually come forward. A woman named Molly says Eddie forcefully rubbed her feet in his lap at a convention in 2011, then invited her to his hotel room to discuss a job opportunity. And when she declined, he never followed through on the job. And a year later, at the same convention, she says he did something inappropriate again. Now, another artist named Maya also said that Eddie did inappropriate things to her at a New Year's Eve party in 2012. But despite that, she emailed him afterwards anyways, desperate for a chance at DC, and he sent her a test script. And when she sent him samples of her artwork, he criticized her female characters for being a little thick. And this is the thing that made her never want to work for DC again. A film critic for the New York Post named Jamie also said that Eddie forcibly kissed her twice in 2006, but she was trying to pitch a Lewis Lane series. And after the second kiss, she stopped returning his calls, but he resorted to dirty talk and voicemails and emails, with him ending one such email with,
"Big kiss. Hope you're warm. Had a naughty dream about you. Teehee."
Her dream of writing comics died, and the Lois Lane series, a project inspired by her personal experience with sexism as a young reporter in the 1980s, never happened. None of these women told DC at the time. They were all too scared of what it could cost them. But as we already know, even after everything, the story doesn't end, as Eddie would soon partner up with Eric to start a new company called Alternate Empire. But while Eddie's victims were all adult colleagues, the same cannot be said about this next DC Comics creator.
There's been a string of accusations of young women in the comic book industry.
It's 2009, and a girl named Aviva Mai is living in Canada, and like so many other young artists out there, she's excited about the world of comics. She's very passionate about art and eager to learn, and so she's determined to make connections in an industry that feels impossible to break into. And that's when she meets Cameron Stewart, someone who could help her career or destroy it with a single word to the right editor. Now, Cameron isn't just any other creator. By this point, he's already an established name in the DC Universe community. He's worked on major titles like Batgirl, Detective Comics, and Hellblazer, and his art style has caught the attention of editors at the biggest publishers in the industry. For someone like Aviva, just meeting Cameron feels like an opportunity, as he's someone with power and links in the industry she's trying to enter. And so they start talking, first at a convention and then through text messages. But what begins as a friendly conversation quickly becomes something else entirely. Cameron, a man in his early 30s at the time, starts flirting with her, and they even go on a date where Cameron would make unwanted advances on her, and even after that he would continue reaching out, sometimes telling her that he's sad he missed his chance to date her. But there's just another problem. Aviva was only at the time, and she doesn't even really know what Cameron was trying to do. And so years go by, and Aviva continues to believe that they're just friends. She doesn't believe what's actually happening yet, but eventually, with an adult perspective, she would finally understand. And this very realization would later expose one of the most disturbing secrets in the DC Universe community. But by the time that happens, several years later, it would be too late, as Cameron is already eyeing his next victim. Kate Leth, a cartoonist and writer who would later on become famous for her work on the Adventure Time comics, My Little Pony, and Marvel's Hellcat, met Cameron in the same year, in more or less the same way, and for the same reasons as Aviva, while he was still involved with her. It was a lighthearted and friendly encounter, at the end of which Cameron so generously offered her to join him in his private hotel room, where he so kindly sketched a drawing of her character, Death, from the Sandman comics, and gave it to her as a sign of their friendship. That, of course, was what Kate thought of the encounter at the time. As a 19-year-old, she didn't know any better, and it would be years before she could take a look back at the incident and notice the not so subtle disturbing signs she chose to ignore at the time, which I will get to in a bit. But while Kate's encounter with him in his hotel room room ended with just that, the same cannot be said for Evelyn Hollow, Cameron's most tragic victim. In 2011, just 2 years after the incidents with Kate and Aviva, young Evelyn was on one of her favorite artists' Twitter accounts, admiring his work while leaving a few fan comments here and there. And it was Cameron who instantly took notice of the young fangirl, and much to her excitement, reached out to her almost immediately. And they too started chatting, something she wasn't aware would haunt her for years to come. Now right off the bat, the nature of the chats would go from flirtatious to straight up creepy, as when Evelyn opens up to Cameron about her failed attempt to leave this earth, she's met with a chilling response.
Well, if it didn't work, why didn't you immediately try again?
As a diehard fan of Cameron's work, Evelyn would force herself to ignore his disturbing behavior and painfully obvious motives of wanting to use her, something she regrettably admits later on, saying that it was the first time someone famous was personal with her, and as someone who has trauma from past incidents of men posing as friends and leaving her as soon as they get what they want, she wanted to believe that Cameron was different and pursued her friendship with him anyway. Now Evelyn turned 18 the following year in 2012, and Cameron decided to visit her home country, Scotland, and ask her out, to which she actually agreed, and the two would quickly arrange to meet in person for the first time at a bar. Now despite knowing him for months by this time, Evelyn is still unaware of Cameron's age, who's 35 now, and has no idea about the concerning age gap of 17 years. And so once fairly drunk, Cameron takes her to his hotel room where he presents Evelyn with a drawing he'd done of her favorite character, just like the one he previously did for Kate. But as it turns out, this was Cameron's way of accelerating things with her and initiating something physical, which is exactly what happened next. Now during their personal time together in the hotel room, Cameron would make suggestive comments on the more girly and younger aspects of Evelyn, who was clearly uncomfortable by his remarks. However, she was still too emotionally invested in him to see him for who he truly is. Now eventually, Cameron would actually move to Evelyn's home country of Scotland and would start seeing her regularly. He would even open up to her about his personal struggles and loneliness, which only made Evelyn fall for him even more. But despite their relationship, Evelyn wouldn't get as physically close with Cameron to the extent he wanted, as she was too scared to actually lose him, believing that he would leave her as soon as he got what he wanted from her, which is exactly what happened in 2016, in what turned out to be the last time Evelyn would ever see Cameron, who ghosted her after they finally made the type of physical encounter he wanted, and then just simply moved back to Canada, leaving Evelyn struggling with depression and completely alone. Now his pattern of inappropriate interest and exploitation of younger girls would continue for years, unchecked, with many more meeting the same fate as Aviva, Kate, and Evelyn. And the worst part is, he's been doing all of this while working on comics specifically aimed at young girls. But all that would change on June 15, 2020. That day, a writer and editor named Katie West posted a now deleted Twitter thread accusing the comic book writer Warren Ellis of abusing his power and engaging in predatory behavior. This tweet opened up a nationwide conversation about abuse and power in the comic book industry, and victims began to speak out. And Aviva, Cameron's first known victim, would finally snap and decide that she's done staying quiet. She would post a thread on Twitter describing what happened to her as a teenager. Now she wouldn't actually name Cameron at first. She just hints to a creator who tried to use her. But later that evening, she would make the decision to name him publicly.
Hey, the post about being taken advantage of as a teenager, I'm talking about Cameron Stewart, the comic book artist.
And this sends the entire comic community into a chaos, as Aviva explains why she was finally speaking up.
I'm only posting this because he's worked on a lot of comics directly aimed at young girls and women, and I want them to know what kind of person he is.
Now shortly afterwards, Kate actually sees Aviva's post, which is gaining a lot of attention, and decides that she too is done staying quiet, and responds to her post with,
I just want to back Aviva up by saying, this happened to me too. I still have the drawing of death he drew me on a piece of hotel stationery. I was 19, he was 32.
But here's the part that makes us even more frustrated. It wasn't a secret, not really at least. Andrea de Monacos, a former convention organizer in Toronto, tweeted,
in the Toronto comics community, it was widely known that Cameron Stewart was a predator, and he'd basically been chased out of town after pissing off too many people. I've warned women away from him multiple times.
And Kate quoted Andrea's statement.
He literally moved to Berlin because he's burned through all the girls in Montreal and Toronto. He said this to me.
Cameron had told Kate directly that he'd relocated because he'd exhausted his options in Canada. And so within days, a total of 14 women had reached out to Aviva personally, each with their own experiences with Cameron, and almost all of them were young adults during the time they were involved with him, with some even saying that they can't even share the details publicly because of how inappropriate they are. Cameron's response to the public backlash was to immediately lock his Twitter and Instagram accounts, setting everything to private, and disappearing from social media entirely. He wouldn't issue a statement nor apology. He wouldn't even deny the allegations either. He would just vanish, but not before apologizing to at least Evelyn. But the damage was done. The stories are out there, and now for the first time, the companies that had been publishing Cameron's work for years were now forced to respond. And on June 17th, just 2 days after Aviva's initial tweet, Bleeding Cool reported that DC Comics had quietly removed Cameron from an unannounced project he'd been working on. The project was simply pulled from their schedule without explanation. Image Comics, which publishes the horror series Ice Cream Man, would also cancel a variant cover Cameron had drawn for issue 20, and the series creators would announce that they'd be donating the commission fee for the cover to Save Horizon, a non-profit dedicated to helping victims of abuse. And other projects began disappearing as well. Dark Horse Comics, which had published Cameron's work on Fight Club 2 and Fight Club 3, distanced themselves, and his recent short story for DC's Catwoman 80th Anniversary Edition would become the last thing he would would ever draw for them. But while Cameron was able to walk free and face no legal consequences for his actions, the same couldn't be said for this next person.
At the time of this recording, is currently in the middle of serving a prison sentence after pleading guilty to charges related to possessing and distributing graphic material depicting minors.
If you've ever read Green Lantern, Justice League, or Martian Manhunter, there's a very good chance you've read something written by this man, and after this case, you'll never see his work the same again. Gerard Jones was one of the most respected writers in the comic book industry. For over a decade, he wrote for DC Comics and Marvel, and actually a handful of other major publishers, shaping some of the most iconic characters in superhero history. His work on Green Lantern alone spent nearly 50 issues, and he's the reason the Guy Gardner version of the character exists the way he does today. He also wrote Justice League Europe for years, helped define the Martian Manhunter in a critically acclaimed limited series, and even co-created El Diablo for DC. But Gerard wasn't just a comic book writer, he was also a respected author of non-fiction books. In 2005, he won an Eisner Award, basically the Oscar of comic books, for his book Men of Tomorrow, Geeks, Gangsters, and the Birth of the Comic Book, which told the history of the comic book industry. He also wrote Killing Monsters, Why Children Need Fantasy, Superheroes, and Make-Believe Violence, a book all about how fantasy and make-believe violence apparently actually helps young people develop. And outside of DC, Gerard co-created a character called Prime for Malibu Comics. Prime was about a young boy named Kevin who could instantly transform into an adult-sized superhero, and you'll soon find out why this is darkly ironic. He also co-created the character Topaz, who later appeared in the 2007 Marvel movie Thor Ragnarok. So by the mid-2010s, Gerard had built a legacy. He was in his late 50s, married, living in San Francisco, and still working on new projects. He also had no criminal record, no red flags, and people in the industry respected him, and many considered him even a friend. But in September of 2016, Google sent a tip to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children that would change everything. YouTube, which is owned by Google if you didn't know, flagged an account that had uploaded a video to a private channel. What they found in the video was a younger person being inappropriately harmed by two adults, and the IP address of the account that uploaded it was traced back to a single residence, and it belonged to Gerard Jones. And so on December 29, 2016, investigators executed a search warrant at Gerard's residence in San Francisco's Mission Bay neighborhood, and when they arrived, they seized multiple electronic devices from his home, and what they found was far worse than anyone expected. According to court documents, Gerard's devices contained tens of thousands of images and hundreds of videos, all depicting the harm of younger people, the youngest depicted having just one experience level. When investigators dug deeper, they discovered that the email address Gerard used to upload the video to YouTube was literally named 8is-the-new-18@gmx.com. And it gets even more disturbing. Before the YouTube investigation even began, Homeland Security had already been looking into Gerard for something else entirely. They believed he traveled to London to meet someone he'd been talking to online, a much younger fangirl. According to investigators, he first made contact with this person when she was just... He sent her images around the same time before then traveling overseas to meet her 2 years later when she was... And he had physical contact with her when she turned 18. Gerard was arrested at a coffee shop near his home on the same day as the search. He was booked into San Francisco County Jail on suspicion of possession, production, distribution, and sending harmful material of people of protected groups. And this news sent shockwaves throughout the comic book world. DC Comics of course immediately cancelled the planned reprints of Gerard's Justice League and Green Lantern collections, and projects he'd been working on were frozen. His name, once attached to some of the most beloved characters in comics, was now attached to something horrific. Now when Gerard was arraigned, his lawyer entered a plea deal of not guilty. His defense emphasized that Gerard had no prior criminal record and asked the public to not lump him in with other types of offenders. Gerard himself even posted a message on Facebook shortly after his arrest saying,
"Thank you all who've offered emotional and spiritual support. More will be revealed with time. I'll be okay. I'm still me."
For over a year, Gerard maintained his innocence. He gathered character witnesses, letters from friends, neighbors, and even fellow comic book creators, including writers who'd worked alongside him for decades, all vouching for him. Some of the more notable people who submitted these letters included the now deceased James Huttnell, who wrote the 1999 series Harsh Realm, and Mike W. Barr, who wrote DC's Batman, Detective Comics, and has even worked on Star Trek and the Suicide Squad. In his letter, James wrote that he'd known Gerard for over 30 years and never saw anything suspicious, and that he'd always been a good guy. Mike mirrored James' statements, noting that he's always been impressed by his integrity, not knowing what Gerard was soon going to use the statements for. One colleague even said Gerard had told him he believed his computer had been hacked and used as a server without his knowledge, but that couldn't have been further from the truth. The trial was set for March of 2018, but then, just days before it was supposed to begin, something changed. Gerard's legal team filed a notice that the trial was being cancelled. The reason? There was going to be a change of plea, and so on April 2nd, 2018, Gerard Jones stood before the court and pleaded guilty to 2 felony counts of possession and distribution, and admitted to everything. And despite literally admitting to the crime, Gerard's defense team used those same character witness letters, the ones written when he was still claiming innocence, to argue that he should be allowed to remain free on bail until his sentencing. They also submitted psychological evaluations, claiming that Gerard had a low risk of reoffending and did not meet the clinical criteria for a certain disorder. And the court, unusually, actually granted the request, and so for months, Gerard remained free while awaiting his sentencing, but he attended therapy sessions. violence, and went to support groups and had to wear an ankle bracelet with a curfew. And then on August 14, 2018, he was sentenced. 6 years in federal prison and 5 years on supervised release afterwards, and over $10,000 in assessments, with additional restitution to be determined for his victims. Garrett began serving a sentence on November 30th, 2018, but was released early from prison on December 30th, 2022, after serving just over 4 years of a 6-year sentence. And according to court records, he will remain under supervision until 2027. Now, as for the comic book industry, most of Garrett's work has actually quietly returned to print over the years. But Garrett is actually far from the only big name in DC found guilty of such a thing.
The Sacramento County Sheriff's Office says they found more than 100 photos and videos of abuse.
It's July 16, 2010. At a funeral home called Luz de Paz in Bridgeport, Connecticut, a family is preparing to say goodbye to a man who just passed away. And as most funerals, they went to honor him with a slideshow, photos of his life and his memories. One of the family members hands the funeral home employee a small thumb drive, telling him it contains all of the photos they need for the tribute. But when the employee plugs it in, what he sees makes him stop cold and immediately call the police. Now, the person who handed over the thumb drive wasn't just some random mourner. He was actually the dead man's son, and a man who spent years drawing some of the most iconic characters in the DC universe. His name is Josue Rivera, but in the comic book world, he's better known by the artist name Justiniano. If you've ever read Day of Vengeance, Beast Boy, and even worked through DC's massive 52 event series, you've seen his art. He drew for The Flash, worked on Dr. Fate in the Countdown to Mystery series alongside the legendary writers Steve Gerber, and even did work for Marvel on The Incredible Hulk, X-Men, and What If series. His style was dark, twisted, and perfect for characters that lived in the shadows of the DC universe. He was especially known for his work on The Creeper, a bizarre, unsettling character that matched Josue's artistic strengths perfectly. But on that day at Luz de Paz funeral home, while Josue was there to mourn his own father, his secret life was about to be exposed in the most accidental way possible. Now, when the police arrive and examine the thumb drive, they find 33 files, and every single one of them contains images depicting the hurt of younger people. But what makes the investigators' stomachs turn is not only the content itself, it is the fact that one of the images appears to be someone in Josue's own family, a girl who, based on their investigation, turns out to be his own niece. And yet, that was only the beginning. After the discovery at the funeral home, police obtained a warrant to search his own house in Connecticut. They seized his personal computer and handed it over to a specialized unit trained in digital forensics. And what they find on that is far worse than what was on the thumb drive. 153 files, and 3 of them are videos. Now, the investigators run the images through something called the Recognition and Identification System, and they're able to identify 35 different victims across the collection. And it somehow gets even worse from here. The investigators discovered that Josue hadn't just been collecting these images, he'd been creating some of them. Using a photo manipulation software, he'd taken the face of a sneeze and digitally replaced it onto images depicting hurt. But Josue actually went into hiding by the time all of this was exposed. And for 10 whole months, the police weren't able to track him down. He was gone. Until May 10th, 2011, when members of the US Marshal Violent Crime Fugitive Task Force tracked him down and charged him with first-degree possession. And as this story too hit the news, the comic book community was shaken. This is a guy who'd drawn Batman covers and who'd worked with some of the biggest names in the industry. But what made things even more heartbreaking was what happened behind the scenes. Josue's wife, Maria, immediately filed for divorce and tried to protect their 2 young sons. She went to court with a lawyer and filed for a restraining order, hoping to keep the children away from their father while the case plays out. But on May 12th, just 2 days after his arrest, a judge would deny her request without explanation. She later spoke out saying,
"We have 2 children whom I tried to protect after the horrific incident of his arrest. So much for a court that really cares about the well-being of the children. God forbid I try to keep my children away from their dad, who just got accused of not a traffic violation or even something like stealing a car, but first-degree possession."
On May 25th, 2011, Josue appeared in court and pleaded not guilty, and the case dragged on for over a year. His lawyer, Diane Poland, called the state's laws draconian and pushed for leniency, but the prosecutors just weren't having it. The state's attorney pointed out the manipulation of his own niece, and the number of materials found on his devices, and the fact that the entire thing only came to light because Josue made a mistake at his own father's funeral. And so finally, on November 2nd, 2012, he changed his plea. He admitted guilty to a reduced charge of second-degree possession, and the judge sentenced him to 10 years, which was however suspended after he served just 3 years in prison, followed by 10 years of probation. And when the judge asked Josue if he had anything to say for himself, any explanation, any remorse for what had happened, Josue simply replied with,
"I think I'm good."
The man who brought the creeper to life on page turned out to be the biggest creep of all, but he isn't nearly as big of a creep as the next guy I'm going to talk about.
During his federal court hearing, his lawyer said Paul Miller was ready to stay off the internet and wear a tracking device, but the judge determined he was a threat to the community and should not be released awaiting trial.
It's March 2nd, 2021, just before 5 in the morning. A squad of armored FBI agents surrounds a quiet house in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Flashbangs go off and the agents with the Joint Terrorism Task Force order the man inside to come out with his hands up. The neighbors wake up to the noise, and they watch as agents carry boxes out of the house. Boxes that appear to contain rifles. The man they're arresting is Paul Miller, better known by his online name Gypsy Crusader. And for years he's been using the faces of iconic DC villains to do something far worse than anything those characters ever did in the comics. And to understand how it got to this point, we have to go back a couple of years. Paul is a Muay Thai fighter, and a really good one at that. He's a US national champion in the World Kickboxing Association, with a promising future, before a car accident suddenly ends his career. And just like that, he really has nothing else to work on. After that, he gets into coaching, training other fighters at the same gyms where he once competed. He also tried his hand at journalism. Nothing major, just filming videos and calling himself a conservative, confrontational journalist. And for a moment, Paul is getting his life back together. But that too would change on the evening of October 12th, 2018. That night, Paul goes to an event at the Metropolitan Republican Club on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. The speaker is Gavin McInnes, the founder of a group called the Proud Boys. Now, the Proud Boys are a far-right organization that's been labeled as extremist by multiple governments, and they're known for showing up at political events, often getting into violent clashes with people on the opposite end of the political spectrum. And on this particular night, the opposite end shows up too. Outside the venue, a group of protesters gathered behind the barricades. These are the members of Antifa, which is short for anti-fascism. Antifa isn't a single organization with one leader or membership card though. It's more like a movement made up of people who show up to oppose far-right events. Sometimes peaceful, but mostly not. Their core belief is that fascism, racism, and hate groups need to be confronted directly, and some members are willing to use force to do it. So you have the Proud Boys inside, Antifa outside, and Paul, who at this point is just a guy with a camera trying to film what's happening as a freelance journalist. But the event is sold out, and so Paul can't get in. So he just stays outside. He's standing there with his camera pointed at the protesters, recording their faces, their chants, and everything. And to Antifa, that's a problem. Now, Antifa members often hide their identities for a pretty simple reason. They don't want to be identified and targeted by far-right groups they oppose. So when they see someone filming them outside a Proud Boys event, they don't see a journalist. They see a threat, someone who might be collecting footage to dox them later, or worse, someone who's sympathetic to the people inside. So they turn their attention to Paul. A group of 6 Antifa members surround him and knock the phone out of his hand. Then, as he's heading home with one of his Jewish friends, they jump him, and Paul tries to rush his friend to safety, but it soon turns so violent that the members take an attempt on his life. And they might have succeeded if it wasn't for 2 members of the Proud Boys who quickly jumped in to his rescue. Now the police are notified and soon arrive, and several people are arrested, but Paul himself is never charged with anything. But the Antifa aren't done with him just yet. They would launch a campaign of harassment against him, because he filmed them, and his face is now associated with that night. Other Antifa supporters also dox him and flood his employers with phone calls until he loses his job as a personal trainer, and then his part-time gig at a gas station. They even accuse him of being an and threaten to burn down his house and kill them. And throughout all of it, in Paul's mind, he's been attacked for simply holding a camera, and then punished over and over again, while the people who have destroyed his life walk free. He feels like no one is on his side. But he also remembers the 2 guys of the Proud Boys who defended him. So Paul makes a choice. If Antifa was anti-fascist, he would become the opposite. If they marched against racism, he would embrace it. And if they opposed, well, he would kind of become one. Paul would soon start posting videos on a site called BitChute, which is basically a version of YouTube with almost no rules, where people post content that would get banned anywhere else. And in these videos, Paul would sit in front of a flag and wear body armor with swastikas stitched onto it. And that's not even the beginning. He would then start talking about Jewish people and say that he wants to hurt them. And when people would ask him in the live streams if he has any army to carry out what he says that he's building one. He also talks about something called the Day of the Rope. Now this comes from a book that's basically a fantasy for white supremacists. In the book, people like Paul take over and start mass executions, hanging journalists, politicians, and anyone in an interracial relationship. And Paul doesn't just reference it. He talks about it like it's something that's actually going to happen one day, like he's waiting for it. And while he's saying all of this online, he's doing something else behind the scenes. He's stockpiling weapons. He buys hundreds of rounds of ammunition and starts building his own rifle, an unregistered one, and he files off the serial numbers so it can't be tracked. He's also learning how to manufacture guns because he believes that a civil war is coming soon, a race war to be specific, and he wants to be ready for it. And he then finds a way to spread his message to thousands of unsuspecting people. Paul will start logging onto Omegle, a website that randomly connects 2 strangers for video chats. But he doesn't go on as himself. He goes on dressed as the Joker, complete with green hair and face paint from the 2019 film. Sometimes he dresses as the Riddler instead too. He waits for someone to connect, often it's a young person just looking to chat, and sometimes it's someone from a minority group. And the moment they appear on screen, Paul would start bashing them, screaming slurs and threats, all while staying perfectly in character. And one of his go-to lines, delivered in his Riddler costume, went something like this.
Riddle me this before you go. I am loud and obnoxious. I like music that rhymes. I'm a fraction of the population, but commit half the crimes. Who am I?
He He would also point a gun at the camera and tell people that they don't belong in his country. And while doing it, he uses the worst language imaginable, and he records all of it. And clips of these interactions will spread across the internet. And the image of Paul as a Joker, gun raised, staring into the lens, would become a meme. Some people share it as a joke, not really realizing what they're actually looking at, and others share it because they agree with him. At his peak, Paul had over 40,000 followers on Telegram and 240,000 on Twitter before getting banned, and he would actually be removed from nearly every mainstream platform there is, but he would just keep finding new places to post. Then in 2021, he would launch what he called Operation Mayhem, where he would make his followers troll the Twitter accounts of President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris. Now here's the thing Paul's fans do not know. He has a criminal record. Back in 2006, when he's 18, he's arrested for shooting several people with a pellet gun. He pleads guilty, and a year later, he's arrested again, this time for selling substances. He serves 180 days and 4 years of probation, and under federal law, that means Paul is not allowed to own any gun, ever. But in January of 2018, he would sign up for a firearm training course in Florida. He completes it, fires a handgun during the training, and then uses the certificate to apply for a concealed carry license. On the application, there's always a box that asks if he's been convicted of a felony, and Paul decides to check no, which is a lie and at the same time a federal crime. Now Florida would deny the application because of his record, but the fact that he possessed a gun during the training, that's already illegal, and now it's on paper. At some point during all of this, federal law enforcement starts paying attention, not just because of the gun charge, but also because of his online activity. The Anti-Defamation League, a group that tracks hate and extremism, has been investigating Paul for months, and they flag him as a volatile white supremacist accelerationist. And the last word, accelerationist, means someone who wants to speed up the collapse of society so a race war can begin. They share what they call significant intelligence with law enforcement, and so in May of 2020, FBI agents show up to Paul's parents' house and ask questions about the statements he's made online, but they don't arrest him just yet. Then on March 2nd, 2021, they come back, and this time they bring the Joint Terrorism Task Force, which brings us to the point when the FBI finally arrests him. When they search the place, they find exactly what Paul's been showing off in his videos. The unregistered rifle broken into pieces and hidden around the house. Some of it is stuffed inside a dryer, and they also find over 800 rounds of ammunition. Everything he needed for the war he kept saying was coming. Now Paul admits to all of it, and so on September 28th, 2021, he's sentenced to 41 months, just under 3.5 years, followed by 3 years of supervised release. And just like that, he was gone from the internet, at least for a while, because on January 31st, 2023, he would be released early for good behavior. But Paul just can't help himself. While still under supervision, he would be back online and start harassing people again. He would even sell racist merchandise from behind bars. And when federal authorities find out, they determine it's a violation of his release terms. And so within days of his release, Paul Miller is sent back to prison. And he's then officially released again on July 2nd, 2023. As of now, Paul Miller is a free man, still online, still with a following, still using the face of the Joker to spread hate. But while Paul has yet to put his plan into action, the same cannot be said about the next guy I'm going to talk about.
Now, although today victims and family members are here for a hearing about and pertaining to the suspect in this theater shooting, they're saying they are trying to keep their focus on the victims and those impacted by what happened that day.
On the night of July 20th, 2012, Alex Sullivan, who voiced the character Aardvark in the cartoon movie Ice Age: The Meltdown, is celebrating his 27th birthday, and he's amongst the 400 people packed into Theater 9 at the Century 16 multiplex in Aurora, Colorado, which is buzzing with excitement. This is the moment everyone has been waiting for. The midnight premiere of The Dark Knight Rises, the final chapter in Christopher Nolan's legendary Batman trilogy, is about to be enjoyed by all of these people. Some have even come in costumes, while others, like Alex, have brought friends and family. Around 10 o'clock, Alex tweets,
Hashtag The Dark Knight Rises. At Real Nerds, oh man, 1 hour till the movie and it's going to be the best birthday ever.
And countless other fans who were there sitting beside Alex who shared this excitement. Among them is 24-year-old journalist Jessica Gavi, who just 1 month earlier had survived the Eaton Center shooting in Toronto, which she barely escaped after leaving the food court minutes before gunfire erupted. She'd even written about the experience on her blog, reflecting on how fragile life can be.
I can't get this odd feeling out of my chest. This empty, almost sickening feeling won't go away. I noticed this feeling when I was in Eaton Center in Toronto, just seconds before someone opened fire in the food court. An odd feeling which led me to go outside, and unknowingly out of harm's way. It's hard for me to wrap my mind around how a weird feeling saved me from being in the middle of a deadly shooting.
Now back at the theater, 27-year-old Matt and 26-year-old Jonathan are there with their girlfriends. Matt and his girlfriend Samantha had just moved to the area together as a couple, and are here with Samantha's older brother Nick, and Jonathan, who'd served the US Navy for 5 years and just wanted to wind down, and decided to ask out his girlfriend Jansen for a movie date. And it wasn't just the adults. 2-year-old Veronica is so excited for the film that she forces her mom Ashley to take her to the movie, even though Ashley is soon expecting another baby. Everyone is ready to witness the conclusion to one of the greatest superhero sagas ever made. But none of them know yet that just in a few hours, this theater would become the site of one of the deadliest mass shootings in American history. And to understand what happened that night, we need to go back to the man at the center of it all. James Holmes was born on December 13th, 1987 in San Diego, California. On paper, his early life looked almost perfect. His father Robert was a mathematician and scientist with degrees from Stanford, UCLA, and UC Berkeley. His mother Arlene was a registered nurse, and James grew up in a wealthy neighborhood, attended a good high school, played soccer, and ran cross country, and by all appearances was a normal kid from a very stable family. But beneath the surface, something was deeply wrong. James began suffering from mental health issues in middle school, when at just 11 years old, he attempted to leave this earth. Throughout his childhood, he was haunted by what he called male ghosts, figures he believed would hammer on the walls at night, and because of that, he would soon become very withdrawn, especially after his family moved from Salinas to San Diego when he was 12. Now, despite these struggles, James was excellent in his academics. He graduated from Westview High School in 2006 and went on to attend the University of California, Riverside, where he earned a degree in neuroscience with highest honors. He graduated in the top 1% of his class with a near-perfect GPA, and his professors described him as a very effective group leader who brought intellectual and emotional maturity into the classroom. And he was also a member of Phi Beta Kappa, America's oldest, largest, and most prestigious academic honor society. And so on the surface, again, James Holmes looked like a success story. But those who worked closely with him saw something different and knew him as stubborn, uncommunicative, and a socially awkward person. People would often find him staring blankly at walls sometimes, and when asked if he was okay, he wouldn't respond verbally. He would just look at them, smirk, and then look away again. Now in June of 2011, James started his PhD in neuroscience at the University of Colorado's Anschutz Medical Campus in Aurora. He got $21,600 from the National Institutes of Health and $5,000 from his university. But little did they know that James would soon be using this money to buy weapons to fulfill one of his lifelong dreams. In graduate school, James started experiencing visual disturbances, like shadows and flickers at the corners of his eyes. He described seeing figures that would fight each other with weapons. And because of this, his academic performance was being affected and would reach a new low when he failed one of his most important exams in the spring of 2012. But what concerned his doctors most wasn't his grades. In early 2012, James began seeing a psychiatrist named Dr. Lynn Fenton at the university's student health clinic. Over 3 months, she met with him 7 times, and what she heard in those sessions alarmed her. James had been obsessed with the idea of taking lives for over a decade. He spoke about his fantasies of harming as many people as possible, and he started warning his classmates to stay away from him because
I am bad news.
Dr. Lynn grew so concerned that she even activated a campus threat assessment team. She believed that James might have schizoid personality disorder, and she noted his psychotic level thinking and was worried about his refusal to discuss details of any plans he might have, and the fact that he wouldn't let her speak to anyone else about him. But Dr. Lynn knew that she had to do something about it, so she considered placing James on an involuntary mental health hold. But in the end, she decided against it, believing it might only inflame him. But this decision would soon haunt her for the rest of her life. 3 days after failing his exam in June, James dropped out of the program completely without explanation, and then he started planning. On May 22nd, 2012, James purchased a Glock 22 pistol at a Gander Mountain shop in Aurora. 6 days later, he bought a Remington 870 Express Tactical Shotgun at a Bass Pro Shops in Denver. And finally, on June 7th, he purchased a Smith & Wesson MP15 semi-automatic rifle. All 3 weapons were bought legally. All background checks were passed. And over the following months, James ordered more than 6,000 rounds of ammunition online. 3,000 for the pistol, 3,000 for the rifle, and 350 shells for the shotgun. He then would get a tactical assault vest, a few magazine holders, and a knife. He also buys a first aid kit and spike strips that he plans to use if police chase him. And on June 25th, less than a month before the attack, James emails an application to join a gun club called the Lead Valley Range in Colorado. The owner, Glenn Rodkovich, calls him several times to invite him to a mandatory orientation for his club, but he only reaches James's voicemail. And when James finally leaves a message in reply, Glenn is disturbed. In the message, James is rambling in a deeply unsettling voice. And the voicemail is so bizarre that Glenn thinks James is trying to copy the Joker, which he was, as he had even dyed his hair orange and red, similar to the Joker. James never shows up to the range, and he never calls back. He's busy preparing for something else. In his apartment, James constructs more than 30 homemade grenades. He wires them to a controlled box in the kitchen and fills them with over 30 gallons of gasoline. The entire apartment is now rigged to detonate if anyone opens the front door. And a few hours before the massacre, a neighbor hears loud music blasting from James's place that he left on to attract attention. Now she goes over to his door to tell him that she'll call the police if he doesn't stop the disturbance. And the door seems unlocked, but just something stops her from opening it. This decision saved her life, and the whole building would have exploded if she just opened the door. But James was already on his way to the theater. He'd bought the day tickets in advance and had a front row seat. The movie finally starts at 12 AM sharp, and James puts his plan into action. About 20 minutes into the film, he stands up and walks towards the emergency exit beside the screen. He pushes the door open and sticks a plastic tablecloth holder in to keep the door open, just enough to get back in. Outside in the parking lot behind the theater, James changes into black tactical clothing, a gas mask, a ballistic helmet, and bullet-resistant gear, before picking up his weapons from the car. And then he puts on a set of headphones playing a techno song called Becoming Insane by Infected Mushroom, loud enough that he couldn't hear anything from inside the theater. Around 12:30 AM, roughly 30 minutes into the film now, James re-enters Theater 9 through the emergency exit, and immediately everyone notices, but no one reacts. Some audience members think he's wearing a costume, like the other fans who've dressed up for the premiere. Others think it's a prank, or maybe some kind of special effects stunt tied to the movie's release. A few actually assume it's a publicity stunt by the studio or theater management, but they couldn't have been more wrong. James stands in the middle and throws a canister toward the left side of the theater, right beside the exit, trapping everyone inside. And gas begins filling the room, and people's eyes start to burn, their throats start to itch, and everyone's vision gets blurry. And then he opens fire. Jessica is one of the first ones to be shot, followed by Veronica and Ashley. Both Matt and Jonathan immediately shoot their girlfriends Samantha and Jansen as soon as they hear the shots, and Alex is already on the floor, dead. Meanwhile, James continues to fire a semi-automatic rifle equipped with a 100-round drum magazine as the people try to flee through the aisles. Now when the rifle actually jams, he pulls out the Glock handgun and keeps on shooting. One bullet passes through the wall and strikes 3 people in the adjacent Theater 8, which is also screening the same film. In total, James fires 76 times, 6 from the shotgun, 65 from the rifle, and 5 from the handgun. 12 people lose their lives. Amongst them are Jessica, Alex, Veronica, and Jonathan and Matt, both of whom died protecting their girlfriends who actually survived. Veronica's mother, Ashley, also survives, but she's paralyzed from the neck down, and soon learns that her unborn child is also lost. It is the deadliest shooting in Colorado since. Now at approximately 12:45, police officer Jason Oviatt finds James standing calmly beside his car in the parking lot behind the theater. He's still wearing the tactical gear, so at first Officer Jason mistakes him for one of their own before realizing who he was, and he arrests him. And weirdly, James doesn't resist. He's described as calm and disconnected, completely detached from what had just happened. So much so that when he's placed in the back of the squad car, witnesses said that he seemed more interested in watching the aftermath unfold than anything else. And then he tells them about the rigged apartment and explosives. Now the police quickly evacuate 5 buildings surrounding his residence, and the next day a bomb squad remotely disarms a device wired to the front door and then sends in a robot to disable the rest. A Batman mask is also found inside the apartment. Now William Reed, the psychiatrist who interviewed James after the shooting, said that James picked the movie simply because it was guaranteed to be full. He'd chosen The Dark Knight Rises premiere not because of any obsession with Batman, but because he knew that a midnight showing of one of the most anticipated films of the year would be packed with people. He'd even considered other targets, an airport for example, but he ruled it out because of security and because he didn't want the attack confused with terrorism. As he wrote in a notebook mailed to Dr. Lin just hours before the shooting,
terrorism isn't the message. The message is there is no message.
The note was presented during the trial as evidence, and in most of the 29 pages, James had rambled his thoughts, with stuff like,
what is the meaning of life? What is the meaning of death?
And on several pages he just repeated,
why?
Now during the trial, his defense team argued that he wasn't guilty by reason of insanity. They presented evidence of his long history of mental illness, his hallucinations, his documented psychiatric treatment, and his obsession with harming people. It stretched back more than a decade. But the prosecutors pushed for the harshest possible sentence, and the judge seemed to agree with that initially. District Attorney George Brauchler made his position clear.
It's my determination and my intention that in this case for James Holmes, justice is death.
And the official trial began on April 27, 2015, and jury selection alone took nearly 3 months. But on July 16th, after deliberating for over 12 hours, the jury found James guilty on all counts. 24 counts of first-degree murder, 140 counts of attempted first-degree murder, and 1 count of possessing explosive, and a sentence enhancement for committing a crime of violence. And so the sentencing phase began on July 22nd. James' father took stand and pleaded for his son's life. He showed photos of his family camping trips and vacations. He told the jury that his son was simply severely mentally ill and didn't deserve to die, regardless of what he had done. One of his childhood friends also came forward and made a statement where he said
he never seemed the type to do something like this.
His old elementary school teacher, Paul Carrer, would back the statement up.
He was a good, sweet, hardworking kid, and I would have expected him to succeed wildly. He was brilliant.
Paul couldn't believe that the man in the news accused of the Colorado killings was his old student. James himself declined to make a statement. Now on August 7th, the jury announced that they could not reach a unanimous decision on whether to not impose death on him. One person, for example, opposed due to James' mental health condition, and 2 others were uncertain. And so without a unanimous decision, the death penalty was off the table. On August 26th, 2015, Judge Carlos Zamora then finally delivers the sentence. As he hands down the sentence, he says,
it is the intention of this court that the defendant never set foot in free society again. The defendant deserves no sympathy.
James Holmes is ordered to pay $955,000 in restitution to his victims, and he remains in prison today, serving 12 consecutive life sentences, 1 for each of his victims, plus 3,318 years. years, with absolutely no chance of ever being released. And you'd think this would be the end of the story, but it actually isn't. Following James's imprisonment, hundreds of young women throughout the country would develop an obsession with him. Not only would they justify his actions, but they would also mail James explicit photos of themselves, so he could enjoy looking at them from prison. And James would proudly put these on display in a cell. One example is a 19-year-old girl who we'll call Julia, who would regularly send James letters and try to befriend him. In one such letter, Julia writes,
"This might get a bit annoying, but I'm going to try to write this like I was speaking to you. You've been warned. So yeah, I'm knitting the scarf thing that is the color of your hair. Coincidence was the main factor in that. It's autumn where I am, so pumpkins and Halloween is about a month and a half away. Most people like Halloween because it allows them to be something they aren't, but I always liked it because it allowed me to be myself. I guess what I'm getting is that, are you a fan of Halloween? You're pretty groovy and you've got great hair. I don't want to assume we like all the same stuff. So what kind of stuff do you like? Books, movies, anything you feel like exchanging notes about? Just go for it and I'll respond. Or won't respond if you tell me to shut up. Whatever you feel like. Hope you're safe. Julia."